he showed me immediately some stuff for my feet that, once we got that opened up, it made a huge difference for, not just my feet, but everything else started to open up. And I think, just each day you work there, you realize how just thorough and thought out Connor is. And, like everything we did, he'd say, how'd you feel? And whatever my answer was to that, he knew what the next step needed to be. And so really can't say enough good things about working with him. The plan he has me on right now has already made a big difference, and I'm only a couple weeks in, so I know it's going to just continue to get better. So really grateful to Connor for having me out there, and I can't recommend working with him enough. He's awesome.
Today, I want to talk to you guys about Danny, who's a current NFL player for the Indianapolis Colts, and he's an offensive lineman. Now, Danny was dealing with some issues that were starting at his feet and working his way up into his hips. I want to talk about how the feet can have such a major influence on the rest of the body and the capacity of the body to put force into the ground and also express mobility throughout it. Now, Danny flew in from Indianapolis to Portland for a week, and he was coming in with some interesting circumstances. He had recently bilateral Lisfranc surgeries, meaning that he had one surgery on each side of his foot to correct a similar problem. Lisfranc surgeries usually involve this part of the foot right here, and usually there is some wear and tear or malformation or malpositioning of the joints in this area. And really the best way to correct it in some circumstances is to simply just surgically put the bones back in a better position. Now, Danny's a pretty big guy, obviously. As an offensive lineman, this guy has to be able to produce a lot of force. And usually what you see with these types of people is they have more of a moderate to lower foot arch. That's just kind of what you see with a bigger population. So when I looked at his feet from side to side, it was clear to me that he did not have the capacity to elongate his arch and move into a pronated position of the foot. And this was throwing off the rest of his body. The foot needs to be able to move into a pronated position like this for us to put force into the ground, so that way we can put force down and the foot yields for us to then push off again. That is a key component of athletes producing force and us moving through the world in the gait or running cycle. Now, when I looked at the rest of his body, it was clear that as an athlete, you're going to be stuck in some degree of anterior pelvic tilt like this. That's totally normal, totally expected. Athletes need to produce a lot of force. They need to extend, so they tend to be in an extension pattern. However, if you get stuck in this extension pattern, you can't move out of it effectively, that can potentially be problematic for your movement and wearing and tearing on certain areas. We don't want it over time. Because Danny's pelvis was so far forward, he had a pretty significant limitation in his hip extension. So when I measured it on the table and I tried to pick his leg up, and I wanted ideally for him to get his knee all the way in line with his hip like this, which is hip extension, he wasn't even close. He was probably 45 degrees short on both sides. He was very, very limited. And that tells me that he has quite rigid hips. He has quite limited ability for him to bring his hips underneath him. And interestingly enough, in order for the hip to properly move into a fully extended position, we do need to have the capacity to pronate our foot and have that yield into the ground as we move into that hip extension. So obviously, that was going to be an issue for him given his inability to create meaningful foot pronation. He also had a significant limitation in hip flexion, which makes sense given the fact that he was already starting stuck in a position of hip flexion. When I tried to bring his leg back on the table, he just got jammed up and couldn't go any higher. But if he had more of a neutral pelvis, that would be less of an issue. So what was interesting about Danny's case is that his tests and movement and posture were telling me that he was shifted over to the left side of his body, and he couldn't effectively push from left to right. Now, he also had the most recent surgery, that Lisfranc surgery, was on his left side. So his left foot was more rigid and it was more incapable of pronating. Both sides were very limited, but the left side was more. So if he's stuck in his left side and his left foot arch is high, he can't put force into the ground to flatten that foot arch and push from left to right. So that was something we needed to address. But he had so many issues on both sides of his body, within his feet and his hips. We just needed to start to sort of decompress him, loosen him up, and then deal with what was left after that. Now, nothing was really going to matter until we improved his ability to get the right movement at his feet, because that was his biggest limiting factor. So what we did was one of my favorite isometric drills and overall exercises to restore proper foot pronation. We did this exercise right here, and basically what this is doing is this is specifically targeting the perineal muscles. The perineal muscles are on the outside of the shin, and they help the foot move into a pronated position, and also helps that transition from mid stance to late stance. So after doing this exercise, he should, and he did, feel a much more strong connection between his foot arch and the ground. It's a fantastic exercise. It's actually in my beginner body restoration program, and I really think that this was the first important step for him to be able to have other exercises see more success, because other exercises involved him needing to use his foot and connect something that was happening in his foot with his hip. And he first needs to be able to find those foot contacts first. Without that, the rest of the exercises are pretty useless. The next thing we did was a 90-90 hip lift, but I did it a little bit differently. Now, because his pelvis was forward, he was also externally rotated. He lacked the ability to get into a posterior tilt or hip extension, and also a little bit more internal rotation. So I did something I usually don't do very often, which is I cued him to squeeze the ball pretty hard. And because he's an athlete, he can isolate the right things and find and feel them correctly. But for most people, I don't like that, because it oftentimes just has them compensate, and they kick on muscles I don't want them to feel. But for him, he was capable enough to do it. And that was allowing him to recruit his hamstrings to pull his pelvis underneath him more, and his adductors to help drive more internal rotation. I also had him focus on the foot contacts of the inner heel and the first metatarsal head, because without that, he would just stay on the outside of his foot like he's used to, and he wouldn't be able to get that connection of internal rotation from the hip to the foot. What I then wanted to do, especially on his left side, because he had such an inability to push from left to right, was we did a right side lying left glute max activation exercise, which the purpose of that was to connect his left glute to his left foot arch and create an awareness of that, so he had a better ability to tell his body, hey, when my left foot arch is on the ground, I want you to help push me out of my left side, as opposed to being on the outside of my left foot and just finding some other compensatory mechanism to push me forward on that side. So that was a very key component for him, improving his mobility within his hips and also his ability to get trunk rotation from side to side. The last thing that we did, and this is a key component, we needed to connect the pronation at his foot in an upright environment to the internal rotation at his hips and the ability to shift into his hips. So what we did was a single leg kickstand hinge. This exercise is so fantastic for driving pronation at the foot and internal rotation at the hip, because a hinge is naturally an internal rotation activity. So I really had him be conscious and have a strong intention to feel those proper foot contacts of the inner heel and that big toe without losing the outside foot, and have him go through a proper hinge, feeling the back of his hips open up as he got to the bottom of the hinge, because that is where you're accessing the most internal rotation, and then coming back up out of that into a relatively full hip extended position. This was the key to connect everything, but we waited until the end of the week, until he was ready for it, in order to do this exercise. And I think that this is such a great example of how the feet can have such a big global influence on the rest of the body. So we can work on hip mobility all day long, or our ability to produce force, but we have to understand and appreciate that the foot needs to work alongside that and be responsive to that. If it's not, then we'll always be limited if that is what is causing our problem. So I hope this was helpful for you to see, and if you want to learn more, I do have several other case studies on my YouTube channel. I have a playlist that you can access, and I also have several more case studies coming soon.